What's up, world? Thanks for tuning in to this edition of the Point Blank podcast. Point Blank explores news and updates in health, business, relationships, and more. The podcast also features guests that are transforming industries, challenging norms, serving as catalysts for momentum, and offering some fresh perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Blank Jr., and since 2016, I've leveraged the modern media landscape to help businesses and brands create more content and make more money. Need a new website? Ready to launch a podcast of your very own? Visit steveblankjr.com today to learn more about why some of my clients are calling me a complete game changer, verbatim. Don't forget to rate, review, subscribe, and share on all of your favorite social and streaming platforms. Let's jump right in to the latest edition of the Point Blank podcast.
Hey there, guys. My name is Matt Hepburn, and I'm an SEO manager and SEO analyst. I've been doing this for about 13 years. Currently, I work for Manulife, which is the Canadian brand of John Hancock, managing all their Canadian properties. And I've worked in agency, both large and small. I've freelanced and I've worked in the enterprise zone now for about 6 to 8 years, somewhere in there. And really happy to be on. I'm also the host of the EMJ podcast and starting up the EMG Academy, where we're going to be teaching people how they can use SEO for their local business and bring in podcast guests, and things like that. So really excited to be on the show, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. My pleasure. Let's kind of set the stage for some of the nuts and bolts that we'll eventually get into. Podcasting and searchability.
Sure.
What's the relationship at a high level?
So podcast and searchability. So it's kind of been changing a lot. So Google last February said they were going to remove their podcast kind of carousel that they had in search engine results away. And they announced that, and I haven't seen that leave yet. So it's still there. Is it going away? It's possibly going away. The question is, for a podcast, you want to show up where the people are. So what are the most popular podcast platforms? And at top is YouTube, right below that Spotify, and then it goes to probably Apple Podcasts underneath that. And to get down to Google Podcasts are way, way down on the list. So so for me, yes, in search, some of that is there and it's present, but really it's really on the platform that people use to look for music in their podcasts that you want to show up. So.
Gotcha. And I guess for context on the nuts and bolts as well, can you let the world know what is a backlink?
Sure. So a backlink is what's called a hyperlink, or a link from a third-party website, and it links off to your content. And a good backlink is one where the page and the website is relevant to your podcast or your content, whether it's on your website, on your podcast, wherever it is that it's linking.
Well said.
Yeah.
Let's kind of unpack an example then for, pick a business or a personal brand. I talked about real estate agents earlier. What's an example of how being a guest on someone's podcast translates to backlinks and increased searchability?
So it's not just even searchability. You can do so many different things with being a podcast guest. So the things that actually help for that real estate agent in their local market, if they're trying to show up in local search, are really going to be, they have an optimization for their business around their Google business profile. So that'll help them show up in Google Maps, in local search results for whatever their being a realtor is. And typically these type of profiles, if they have one location, are linked to the homepage of their website. So if you can be a guest on other shows about real estate, maybe it's about flipping real estate or real estate investing, and have a link within the show notes of that episode that you're on, or if it's a YouTube episode, within the description of that YouTube, linking back to your homepage, then that's going to help increase basically these links power up the ability to rank for certain keywords that are associated with local search results. So it just helps catapult you in rankings for specific keywords around that page.
Gotcha. I
Right.
really
It
sorry.
depends on the competition of the keyword too.
Of course, absolutely. And that probably plays a role in this next question as well, which is the number of backlinks that it takes to
Right.
rank highly. When I read that question, I immediately was reminded of the countless businesses and brands that think that SEO is just kind of a plug and play. Like I can throw money at an assistant or an agency, and um, they'll bring it all to life. And I guess all of that really to say, like, there's real intention and thoughtfulness that goes into being able to rank. So whether it's the thoughtfulness and the qual side of things, or whether it's the number themselves and the quant side of things, with regard to being a podcast guest, what kind of content do I need to be producing? How many links, how many episodes in order to show up anywhere near where I want to be?
So there's a bunch of questions within that question. So I'll try to do it. Let's actually tackle, like, how do you figure out how many links you need to build, or how many podcast interviews you need to have that have links in their show notes linking back to your website? In the case of what we're talking about right now, the scope, because that's the type of backlink that we're talking about. So what you'd want to do is you'd want to have a tool, a metric tool on links like Ahrefs or SEMrush, and you'd want to actually put in the keyword that you're looking to target for your homepage of that website, right? Or if you have multiple locations, for that location page that's associated with that location. That's going to be within your content. And then you're going to say, well, what are the amount of backlinks that each one of these top 10 results that are on the first page of Google, and how many backlinks does each one have, and what is the average of that, and how many referring domains do they have, and what is the average of that? So as long as all the backlinks are kind of similar in number, right, you can use that average. And then you can say, well, how many links do I have pointing to the page that I want to rank? And then you're able to use the same software to get that amount of links. And so what you're looking for is the delta in between those two averages. However, if there are some sites within the top 10 results that have a lot of links that would skew the number, right, of that average, you want to default over to the amount of referring domains instead of the backlinks. And then you're just basically saying, I need this many sites by average linking to me. And then you're saying that is the average, and then what's the delta in between the referring domains. And the reason why you do that is that one site can have thousands of backlinks pointing to a site, right? And it's very spammy. And you've got a question like, how did they get that type of, like, is it on, in a footer or something that's being populated across thousands of pages or something like that? It's not a good SEO tactic, right? It's not something you want in 2023 or 2024. So that's why you default at that point to the amount of referring domains. And then you can literally say, I need, if the average amount is 12 and you have one, you need 11 podcast interviews that are linking back to you to be able to be on the first page of Google.
I love it. That answer, I mean, in a world where searchability and searchability services are so, my default microphone has been changed. Let me double check this. No, everything looks the same.
Mm-hmm. You sound good.
In a world where searchability services and digital marketing endeavors, all too often it's so wishy-washy. There's a lot of jargon. It's a lot of like presenting it in this mythical, magical way of, we understand languages and tactics and techniques that would take you forever to begin to grasp, is the way it feels all too often. And you very simply just synopsized how to identify your goal, the endpoint, and essentially reverse engineer what you need to achieve in order to get to that place. So
there's one caveat.
Okay.
So if those sites have a lot of internal links pointing to, of their content on their site, pointing to that page,
Pointing
right?
to its own
So it's the
website.
page, right? So if it has other pages that are pointing to the page that is ranking within that top 10 search results, those pages can also influence the amount of authority or link authority, or what we call link juice. If they have links from those other pages have links pointing to them, or they have authority, Google sees them as authoritative, they can also influence the amount of links. So that's the one caveat.
Positively?
I'm sorry.
Influence them positively?
Oh yeah, yes, influence them positively, but you're not going to see that in as a metric, right? As if you're basically saying, I need 11 referring domains to link over, and then, but one site has, let's say, 6 or 10 pages that are linking to that one page that have, links from other websites linking to those other pages. The link authority can pass through those internal links and influence the ranking of that page. So if that page is higher up, let's say in positions 1 through 3, you're not going to see that through those metrics. So you got to take all this with a grain of salt, is what I'm saying. And this is the average. And sometimes you'll get there faster, and sometimes it may take a few more links to get you to where you need to be.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Very well said. Appreciate it. What let's talk a little bit about the course coming up. How about can we start with
Sure.
an ETA? Is there a date on availability?
So the course that we're doing is the first course that we're doing is going to be teaching people how to build links, how to vet data from different data sources to figure out which podcasts they can get to that actually link over through their show notes to their guests and their guests' website assets. That's the first thing, right? Teaching them how to do that, teaching them how to do outreach, which is an art all into itself, and getting people to agree for you to be on a show. So, and what are all the benefits of that? So we're looking to have that done within the next month. So probably Halloween, maybe the beginning of November, and have that set up on a site called emjacademy.com. And that'll be the first iteration of what we're teaching. And hopefully, whether it's a local business or it's an agency, that they can find value with it. That's what's part. But we're going to be giving away some free, of course, assets that they can download. If they're not ready to take the course, they can have a bunch of information and related content around it as well.
Sure. A lot of this stuff, I mean, it's super comprehensive. If you're a business owner, then it's likely secondary unless your business is already in digital marketing, i.e., if I'm a real estate agent or if I am a restaurateur and I just, open my new place downtown, whatever it is, this is going to be new to me. I'm sure it's comprehensive, in depth, all of that to say, best case scenario, do you think in those situations for either one, the restaurateur or the realtor, should the realtor take this course and enroll with the academy, or is that something that if the opportunity existed, would you sooner say, dear real estate agent, keep being a great realtor, send your assistant, send your marketing admin, send your, this is for that person? Or would you say that the business owner themselves should really have an understanding of the content along the way?
So it's a very valid question. It really depends upon how much time the business owner has, and if they have staff that they can have that are dedicated towards doing marketing, that they could do that. But being on a podcast has so many more benefits besides these backlinks. Just real quick, one of the things that you can do after you've been a guest on a show is you can say, hey, if I provided value to the podcast host, this is even before it's published live, would you mind leaving a review? And you can have them leave a review, an honest review on your Google business profile, your BBB profile, your Yelp profile, and all three of the, or if it's industry specific, if there's a industry specific site where you have a profile where reviews can be left, that's all really relevant for, and they're local ranking factors that Google loves for, and it affects both the Google local pack or 3-pack, we call them, Google Maps, and also it is a another ranking factor for the local organic. So that's one thing. You have social proof. You can say on your website, as seen on or as heard on this show, right? With permission from the host, you can use the logo. If not, you can just, put it out in your regular font, however that is on there. These are great things. And then you have the ability to have referral traffic come to your website. So referrals traffic is great. So if you have a great, let's call it a lead magnet, or typically a download for what you do for whatever that potential buyer is. Maybe if it's a realtor, it's a guide to what you need to know about buying your first home or whatever it might be, right? So it's some type of lead magnet that they can get. And then you talk to the podcast host beforehand, and you'd say, I really want to promote this. I think it's going to provide value for your audience. And the podcast host lets you talk about that at the end of the show. So it's great.
What's your approach to podcasting personally? Are you more so, I mean, you've obviously got your own program. Here we are collaborating on another. Do you try to strike a balance of both? What's the ratio for you in terms of EMJ pods to all things otherwise?
Right. So I am just as guilty as any other business owner. I spent a lot of time this summer trying to figure out how to monetize my business. And so I was not as diligent with my podcast as I had been in the past. So that's changing. So typically what I like to do is get at least one episode out per week, but it really depends upon the podcast and how often, how much time you have associated to do this. Some people have time to just say, I'm going to take 2-3 days in a month and I'm going to record. I'm going to have all these different interviews or sessions booked. It really depends on what type of podcast you have. If you're doing the session yourself, if you're doing it with a co-host, if you are doing interviews, there's so many different formats. I would say interviews are probably the easiest for me because I can do a little bit of keyword research up front on the topic that I want to talk about, create some questions. But the point is with doing this, I want to align the questions and the topic to the podcast host audience and to the podcast host, so it makes sense. And you're trying to find a gap of something that the podcast host hasn't covered, or an angle. Maybe it's just a twist. They've talked about this topic, but they haven't really done this one thing. How can you create value for the podcast host? You should be treating this as relationship building. A lot of the podcast hosts that I talk to many times during the year. I kind of feel that they're like extended friends, even though they've been guests, and, you're building relationships. You never know where this is going to go in the future with the people that you're talking with. So
true. And even more true in the post-COVID landscape, right? Like we were doing more coffee breaks, or I forget how we called it, but I was doing like every Tuesday, and I would have everybody from like my grandmother to clients and colleagues on the same Zoom call. And it wasn't a podcast, but it was really just a means for maintaining some degree of interpersonal communication in a world that is increasing, is less and less personal every day,
Absolutely. It became your community. We have a prayer group at our church, not to get religious on you, but we have a prayer group in our church that meets almost daily and has met since COVID, and it's become an extended family. So, these communities, regardless, it doesn't have to be church, but these communities are great because you can check in, you can recheck in with a podcast host, find out what they're doing. And if they're not a podcast host, if they're a guest, you check in with them. And there are different things that you can, different business opportunities that you can build from these relationships. So it's great.
Yeah. I mean, it's one more form of modern day networking, right? Except you don't have to go to the networking event to do it. And so within this opportunity to create content and relevant backlinks for each other, we are also two humans sharing time and space that kind of get a feel for that. That's part of why early on in this conversation I was like, help me really understand your model, so to speak,
Right.
so that I can, in conversation and in day-to-day life with referrals,
Hmm.
etc., best complement that,
No, that's very nice. The for me, it's it's I missed it because for the last 2-3 months I've been, like I said, working more on how do I monetize this? Got to make sure we're making some money with the business as well, which is important if you have a podcast. It's also important if you're going to use it for a local business, how do you make that work? And so you have to kind of make a decision. Am I doing it to get more growth to my business as growth marketing, whether it is podcast backlinks from show notes, whether it's referral traffic? I can tell you one thing: if you have a podcast for your business, which is just another avenue of communication to a larger audience, the more interviews that you do, the bigger opportunities you have to grow your audience. But there's some key things that you have to do. And I'm actually going to mention Kevin Chemlin from Grow the Show, which is another podcast. So typically with a podcast, you want to do 3 or 4 things. So you want to really talk very quickly about and concisely to a user as to what benefit they're going to get out of the episode. You want to explain with 10 words what your podcast is about, kind of like an elevator, talk as to like how can you communicate what your pitch is.
Sure.
And then you want to explain why you are relevant to talk about that conversation. Like what experience do you have? And you want to keep that short as well, right? You need to do all these things to keep the attention of the listener. You have to, with a podcast, assume that it's a first-time listener. You can't assume that it is a returning listener with every single episode. So how do you hook them and keep them? And this also happens with other like little chapters within the podcast. How can we talk about whether it's a question or whether we edit it and we put in a little intro to the question to keep the listener engaged, to keep them curious. And one of the biggest things we can do is look at podcast analytics and see where our listeners are dropping off. And then we can go, aha, I have a moment. Like, what did I do there? Okay, I'm rambling there. So how do I, instead of rambling there, how do I make it more concise? How do I communicate to the user very quickly what they're going to get out of this section of the podcast?
And you're doing that front loading that information, it sounds like, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And possibly throughout depending on how you edit it, it could be throughout the whole episode.
Sure. That reminds me very much of the modern day approach to producing video content in short form for social media. Essentially, the first 2 to 3 seconds are the place where you can lose your audience as quicker than the rest. And that volatility, you get it with the hook, and the hook is supposed to speak to why you want to hang around past the 3-second mark and the value that this information or insight or expertise or bit of entertainment is going to bring to your life. And you have to do that all within that first couple of seconds. You also mentioned being able to find ways to make things more dynamic to keep listeners engaged. So maybe in the midst of, recorded conversation, we cut to a more highly produced, bells and whistles and the production elements of it to give context to the question or the aspect of the conversation that's coming up. And that reminds me in video of, I get your attention and I've got you past the 3-second mark, but now it's like 6, 7 seconds. Oh my God, all you want to do is scroll to the next thing. I'm going to cut to B-roll, or I'm going to reference stock footage, or I'm going to pull up a graphic overlay that adds to the message or makes it more dynamic to keep you on the line,
So you mentioned a few things there. So YouTube for longer form video, right, is all about clickability and likability. So one of the benefits of a long form YouTube podcast or video is that you can have a thumbnail up front that is enticing the person into the episode. With a short on YouTube, unfortunately, they don't have thumbnails right now. So you can't do that to bring them in, right? So shorts typically have, depending on how they're produced, they might have, like you were saying, for more produced, I might not cut to more highly produced, but I might have more visual elements, and it might even be animations that are going on while I'm to keep the person's attention within the short and keep them engaged. And that can be pretty basic, from like text that's scrolling to like little explosions or laser beams that are coming or flashes. It really depends on how it's produced. But
Sure,
that
or
helps.
even in something as subtle as like a ticker, or
Exactly.
a call to action, for another platform, or to follow your guest or whatever it is. There's countless opportunities to insert animation here, right?
Right, but that's how you keep that engaged. It's harder when you have longer form video on YouTube, because now you have to keep them engaged the whole time. So besides the clickability and likability and the thumbnail, what is the overall thing that you're actually portraying in that video? The video has to have a purpose for sure. And YouTube podcasts are a little bit different from the YouTube long form video format. So and I'm sure you know about that a lot more about that because you do a lot of editing on that. So but for
Which
me,
reminds me, sorry, before
go
I
for it.
forget, I do think you can, in fact, I'm pretty sure I know, but you're making me second guess myself now. I think you can add thumbnails to YouTube Shorts, but you can only do it upon the original upload. So I don't think you can go into your studio or go into your edit details
Right.
afterwards and update it. I think it has to be a part of your video. So it's one of those things where, similar to like Instagram Reels. Oh no, that's completely opposite of Instagram Reels. Instagram Reels, you can have a JPEG, a PNG, an image file, and then add that. In the case of YouTube, I believe the situation is that your JPEG or your thumbnail image needs to be a part of the video file itself, at which point, when you are doing the original upload, I think there's a little pencil icon in the corner of the video image. And if you click that, it gives you the opportunity to scrub around and you can pick that frame, which I tend to just stick on the front.
All right, we'll have to talk more about that. I've done that before where I had it and then it ended up at the back of the video of the short.
I wonder
Because I
if
didn't do the pencil scrub thing. So,
Oh, gotcha. Yeah,
right.
yeah. And I
So,
think that's all what it's about. And it's like the other unfortunate aspect of that is that it's something that you have to do in the moment with that edit there.
mhm,
So it's like, sometimes I like to just get content out and go back and say, like, you know what, let's have a thumbnail day. Go, like,
mhm,
let's make all of these that haven't had awesome thumbnails yet. Go do some custom thumbnails.
right.
And that opportunity just doesn't exist on YouTube. You got to kind of be that much more ahead of the game there.
We're missing something too, though. We're not talking about streaming live podcasts. So there's
Okay.
that other aspect. So when you stream live, you have, for the short time that you stream live, a higher searchability on YouTube. So, but it's only for while that's a very short window after that's live, where it's going to drop back down again because there's plenty of other live content that's being pushed.
And that's exclusive to YouTube we're talking about, right?
That's correct.
And I think you have to have a minimum number of subscribers in order to live stream on YouTube.
I'm not sure. I know different platforms like Riverside.fm and StreamYard have the ability to stream to multiple different platforms.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. So you're saying that the same opportunity exists if we use third parties to API and go in live? Because
That's
you're
right.
absolutely right. I've used StreamYard, and it easily syncs up with your YouTube and you can run live.
That's right.
But I do think to go live direct to YouTube, you need a minimum of like 1,000 subscribers, which
Right. So
is
it's
a bit of
probably
a hill
just,
to climb if you're just getting started.
yeah, probably just with the tools, right? So,
Yeah.
but honestly, you want to have a tool if you're doing a podcast that is going to be able to handle high quality video, to be able to have the audio as well, and be able to say, can I switch it into a format? So right now we are across from each other, right, horizontally. But when you go onto something like YouTube, right, you need to have a different, they need to be stacked in a mobile format, right? So the platform needs to be able to switch the video to that format.
Gotcha.
Right. So StreamYard and Riverside both do that.
Riverside can do live streaming also?
You can.
Gotcha. The reason I leaned into Riverside was the way it's separated the audio and the video feeds, and it was just a little more advanced on the production side of things. I never used it for live streaming. That's good to know.
Well, the thing with these tools, right, depending, and you have to, if you're going to get a podcast tool that does streaming, you have to pay attention to what has to happen to upload the content, right? Is the content constantly being uploaded locally and into the cloud for the local recording? So you get the high quality recordings of like 4K in video and great crisp audio. Or does the guest have to stay on till it finishes uploading before they close their browser?
Not a fan of that.
Not a fan of that myself either, right? So that
Learn the
me,
hard way.
yeah, that to me is a limitation, and it's something that people have to look to because guests don't want to stay to upload the, they have things to do. So they're busy business people.
Right. The last thing you want to do is, I mean, it'd be one thing to ask somebody to stay because we have additional questions. It's like, do me a favor. Can you just stay on the line and continue to occupy your device that you probably want to use for 19 other things right now while we finish buffering,
Yes. And the question is, how long is that going to take, right? Depending upon how long that interview is. If it was an hour and a half interview, how long is that going to take to load up? It could be 10, 15 minutes. So is that guest really going to stay on for that long? Right. You really want to have a platform that's uploading constantly while you're recording.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We briefly mentioned outreach earlier. You want to
sure,
deep dive and unpack email outreach a little bit?
Sure. So let's actually talk about data platforms for email outreach first for podcasts, right? So part of doing this is you have to identify podcasts that are available, right? So there are two main data providers, Listen Notes and PodSeeker. And I've had memberships with both. And they're both relatively affordable. I think Listen Notes was for the middle, I think it was around 150, 179, something like that. And PodSeeker is about 99. There is a difference though. So they both are searchable. So you can search by a keyword and find a podcast on the platform, or you can reverse engineer a guest that is a leader within your industry. So you can actually search that name. So, I might want to look for Brian Dean or Neil Patel or something like that in the SEO space. And then I can find every single podcast that they've been on and with a different episode. So I can say, oh, they've been a guest on this. Let me look at the metrics for these different podcasts and maybe I'll do outreach for them. So for any podcast for link building that you're going to potentially do outreach to, you have to double check their website and make sure that they link back to their guests, that they have guests, and they link back to their guests' assets. So it's only about 33% of all podcasts that do this. And there's reasons behind that. So some of them just use platforms like Spotify or iHeartRadio or whatever to host their podcasts, and they don't have the ability to have show notes. So it is just uploading the audio, and those are usually just strictly audio podcast. So those are what we'd call podcast aggregators and sometimes podcast aggregator websites. And then there are self-hosted websites like WordPress and things like that people have, but not all of them have show notes. So and not all of them link off to their guests. So it's really critical when you're doing this, you're going to have a column on your spreadsheet where you're going to vet, hey, do they have a website? Are they linking to their guests, right? So that's the first thing that you want to do. Two other points when you are looking to do this, you want to be scalable in what you're doing. If you're using Listen Notes as a data provider, it's extra money, actually hundreds to thousands of dollars to export their data. Otherwise, you're have to have somebody pulling that data piece by piece and putting it into a spreadsheet. Whereas PodSeeker, you pay for your membership and you're able to create PR lists based on your searches, and then you can export that PR list. And then you can do all your vetting within that Excel spreadsheet. And that to me is key, because I need to be able to, when I'm doing this, go through the different websites. I have it there. I have a whole bunch of different metrics there. I'll have, is it a explicit podcast? What is the title? What is the description of the podcast? How many average listeners do they have per episode, which is key, right? If you're able to sort in a pivot table and say, I want to tackle everybody over 500 listeners per 0 to 500 listeners they have per episode, now you're hitting with the big boys, right? And when you're first starting out, you don't want to do that. You want to start on and get your chops on with local podcasters and build those relationships. Those are just as important as the big ones, but the big ones are going to influence referral traffic that comes over. So there's other things that you want to look for. You want to look for, is there an email associated with the podcast? Is it associated with the host name? Can you see that? And then you're going to use another tool like hunter.io to validate those emails, because you don't know how old those emails are that are on that list. And typically the emails are associated with what's called the RSS feed, or the real simple syndication is what that is. That's associated with the podcast media host. So if it's Blueberry, or if it's Captivate.fm, that's I think who I use. There is always an email address, and it's usually only visible when you're submitting that podcast feed to an aggregator like iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify. And it's available for a short amount of time so they can validate that it's a real person behind the podcast and who you are. So that's what so that data is actually pulled through the data aggregator. But how old is that data? How old is that email? Is it podcast@domainname.com, or is it one of those email addresses that's associated with the podcast host? So with a tool like hunter.io, you can look at the domain as well. Not only can you validate an email, but you can look at the domain that the podcast website is on, and you can see all the emails that are associated with that domain, and it will cross-validate that with other instances online, like social media profiles and things like that. And then it will give you a score percentage-wise of how strongly they believe that is a valid email. And the reason why that's important is when you do email outreach to a podcast host for a potential guest interview, you don't want to have emails bouncing back at you, because if you have emails bouncing back at a large percentage, your email ISP provider like Gmail or Yahoo or whatever it is, they can actually then blacklist your email, and the email is associated with your domain if you're a business. So if you have Matt at, let's say, emjacademy.com, right? I'm going to be extremely protective of that email when I'm doing outreach. I'm not going to do any mass email when I'm doing this outreach too. I want to actually, when I'm doing an outreach to a podcast host, we're talking about what we were talking about before, right? The pitch, you want to listen to their podcast. You want to see what their premise of their podcast is about. You want to see if they've talked about the topics that you're an expert on, and where's the opportunity for you to actually provide value. So is there a twist that you can do? Is there a gap that you can basically propose, right? And you want to pitch two ideas and say, I think that I could bring a lot of value to the show by this or this to your audience. What do you think? If you want more information, I'd be more than happy to send you my podcast one sheet, which has bio information, your links, all of your stats, right? And that's really, really key to be able to leave it open-ended. And I would do things also to the email that you're using, I would always use something like potential podcast guest for, and then the podcast name. And that allows you, when you're going back through your email, to search for the podcast name. And then it's all associated with, all that is outreach, right? So in case you're using this email for other things as well.
Right.
So you can put a filter in there, you can, put them or in a specific folder, right? Organize it. So.
Yeah, no, that's all great insight, especially to tie it back to something that I think is all too often overlooked when it comes to outreach is your essentially what becomes your domain authority, right? And those
Right.
emails that get kicked back and how that can negatively affect you. So in a world where we're talking about growing searchability and
Yep.
improving the perception of our domain, it would be
extremely detrimental.
Yeah. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
You wouldn't get, if you get blacklisted, you're not going to get any emails. Like that's literally it. So some people use so if you've got a .com domain, some people use a .org, right? They just do a little change in their email and they buy that domain so they can they're doing outreach on the .org or something like that, or .net, whatever it might be, and then it's not affecting their website.
That is precisely a tactic that I use.
Yes. So
it's just a variation, and I don't think this should negatively impact my home domain, but the way I have it set up is the domain that I use to send emails at scale points to my home domain through the DNS settings.
Yeah. And honestly, I can't tell you that because I don't have the personal experience of seeing that negatively impact, but I think you're doing it the right way. So the point is, if you have what is the use for your email, right? If you have an email that specifically you want to talk to your customers with, or your customer service email, right? I wouldn't use that. And I wouldn't specifically make an outreach email on your domain for it. I would do this tactic where it's like a slight variation of the domain name, and then do that, and then just not have to. You still want to be careful, right? Everybody tends, when they do email outreach, to do bulk email and say, well, I got a template, I'm just going to personalize it with these few things. But we got to remember, this is relationship building. And the first step in building a relationship is to be able to set yourself apart from the rest of the proposed guests that they have. You're not only you're pitching them, you want to explain to them that through what you're doing, that you understand what the premise of that show is. You get what they're trying to do, right? And you also want to explain how you know that, right? Did you listen to an episode? Everybody should listen to like at least one episode all the way through, or at least to the key parts, and then find something in common. When we talk about doing outreach, we always talk about like how, or even a sales pitch, you always want to find something in common with the person who's sitting in front of you, right? So if you can find something that's funny or insightful from an episode and say, I really like that, right, in your email, and talk about that first, and then kind of go into where it gets a little cheesy. I know it gets a little cheesy, but it lets the host know you're not just doing outreach without listening to the show. You've listened to the show, you've found a gap or an opportunity, and you understand the alignment of what, for the most part, what the show is. If it's really, really broad, then you can bring it down to like, what is the alignment of a category that he's talking about on the show, right? Read the about page, read the the about page, read the host bio if there's something there on that, right? Look at their experience, tie it into that.
Absolutely. And I want to add to that it's perfectly reasonable to try to strike a balance of both, in terms of when you I guess does that make sense? And in terms of
so I mean, you don't want it to be leaning too far in one direction or not. The point is, you want to you also want to keep these emails relatively short, right? So 2 paragraphs at the most. Don't go on like crazy. Get to your point to your pitches within like 1 or 2 sentences, right? And because these are business people that you're doing outreach to, they're just as busy as you are.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't want your first email to seem like a ramble, right? The key part, one that now once you actually do outreach and they have agreed to be on the show, and then you've or agreed to be, whether you're doing outreach for somebody to be a guest, or if you're doing outreach to be a guest on their show, right? It works both. This works both ways with that premise. The thing that you want to do as a podcast host or podcast guest is you always want to tie the questions, right? We talked a little bit about doing keyword research. And one way that you can do keyword research, you could use a tool called Also Asked, which highlights all of the people also asked questions in Google, right, for specific keywords. So you could say, I want to talk about this topic. That's where it's at. You can go find out what those top questions are, right? And then you can look at them and say, well, what are these aligned to my experience into the podcast, what we've just talked about, right? And then you could propose some of those as questions, and you put in your own experience as well to that. And you send that off to the podcast host and you say, here are some questions I'd like to talk about that. Can you confirm these questions are good for you? Tell me if there's any that you want me to remove. Is there anything that you want to ask me or talk about, depending on whether you're the host or you're the guest, and then you put it to that and you get their feedback and you get approval. And the reason why this is important as being a podcast guest specifically is you don't want to have the same questions asked over and over again. So in a podcast one sheet, which is kind of what we were talking about before, your bio, kind of your information, the topics that you can talk on, and some of the top questions. If you leave it to that and you're constantly pushing that, then your questions are going to be asked over and over again. And what is the podcast host, if they do their due diligence and they look where you've been a guest before, they can see you've already answered these questions. Mm-hmm. How is the episode that you're providing different to them? How do you make it valuable to their audience, right? If you're answering the same questions over and over again on multiple podcasts, you can't. So those are questions, they're kind of like a lead-in on that, but you should always make questions specifically to that audience and the podcast host.
Right. Yep. Or if you feel kind of boxed in and like the questions are the only questions that come to mind, there is absolutely an opportunity to take a look at this new audience or community and identify the nuances of the hurdles that they encounter, and basically tailor the conversation or recontextualize the answer so that while it may be in ones and zeros the exact same solution or response, in delivery it was meant dynamically different this time and was shaped for brain surgeons versus busboys.
You're 100% right on. So I can take the local search topic, and I've been on a lot of podcasts talking about that, but like, what is the audience? So I had one audience that was in Australia and it was on dental marketing. So you tailor it to the same solution, but you're tailoring it now to dental marketing, right? How is that applicable to dentists? What might the content around dentists be and things like that? So it's exactly right. Whereas, another episode might be on kitchen remodeling. So,
sure.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, I want to be respectful of your time, even though the more we talk, the more questions I have. Perhaps that warrants a circle back, or we'll do this the other way, like you mentioned before. Before I let you go, I definitely want to ask you to drop some information on the audience at large. Where can we learn more? How can we get in touch with regard to all things EMJ and the Academy?
Sure. So my podcast is called the EMJ podcast, or the Entrepreneur's Marketing Journey Podcast. It's a marketing podcast. It is emjpodcast.com. and you can get all the episodes there. And then, like I said before, we're opening up the emjacademy.com probably around Halloween and with the first course. And we're going to be adding more courses about some of the topics we talked about, like um, how do you take a video podcast, convert it into an audio podcast? How do you cut it up into shorts? How do you take a transcript from a podcast, and the transcript might be generated by AI, but you put it through Word spell check and you double check it? How do you then use AI to rewrite that content as, instead of a conversational a transcript, into a blog post? And then how do you go in, once again, double check it, review it, maybe add a point of view, and now you have a blog post that you can post on this? How can you take those shorts and create shorts maybe on localized content? So now you have local content that you could embed on that local page. You can then show up twice as much for the local video as well as the organic content. And you could also take one of these up to 60 seconds and put it in your Google Business profile and show up in Google Business results with a video, but there's no audio on that.
Right.
So,
Are you familiar with Gary Vee's clouds and dirt metaphor?
like Gary Vee a lot. He's direct and to the point, but I'm not familiar with this.
Yeah, it's kind of just like a parallel to macro micro concept. And I guess where I'm
Right.
going with this is, this conversation has been micro and macro, and it sounds like the Academy is going to be just that also. And I just can't tell you how excited I am for you and the folks that pursue the Academy, because
Yeah.
I think it's the balance of those two things in this world: the macro of how it works, the why behind, backlinks, and the high level overview, the 40,000 foot overview of the tools and techniques and the tactics, and then getting all the way down to, you dropped a dozen gems of websites on this podcast
Right.
alone that would be helpful resources to people. So it sounds like you're approaching this from here's the high level overview, so you understand the game we're playing at large. Also, here are the individual plays that we're going to run each down in order to get where we're trying to go. So stoked for
Yeah.
that.
We're gonna be comprehensive. So we're gonna have an SEO core um, module, which will be everything for on-page SEO, technical SEO. We're gonna have a manual SEO audit and PowerPoint file for them to teach them how to do an audit, so whether they are doing it for their own site or if they want to be an SEO analyst or do freelance, whatever it might be, right? Could be for agencies as well. We're just trying to keep this comprehensive. For me, this is a way for me to leave legacy information, but at the same point, legacy information is only good as maybe for a year or two, and then it's outdated. So for right now, the key thing is that we have major changes in search. We have something called the SGE, or basically an AI response from Google on how they're going to show search results. Like, how do you get content within there? Shorts are one way. And then as well, you have a lot of people that are creating AI content for websites. How do you stand out against that content? And they're also creating the content and spamming with links. They're basically putting this content that's just created via AI. They may not even look at this content. They just create it. And then they're putting it on different platforms and linking it back to their website. So how can your links stand out and be more strong than this AI content? And the way to do it is with showing a point of view, experience, and expertise within your content, both in and podcast interviews are the best opportunity for that, because you're doing that with an interview. And there's other things that we can do. We'll talk about personal schema and SEMrush schema, and connecting within Google all of your profiles so Google understands you as an entity across the web. Yeah.
Looking forward to it, Matt.
Yep.
Sounds good.
All right.
I'll circle back with you in email, and we'll keep the conversation going. Maybe explore doing this the other way around. I don't have to tell
Absolutely.
you a thing about the micro content that will be generated as a result of our time here today, which again, I value greatly. And we'll keep this rig rolling. We'll explore any potential for synergies along the way as well.
Sounds great, man. It's been a pleasure being on the show.
Awesome. I appreciate your time, Matt. Thanks again. Been a pleasure
Absolutely.
chatting with you, and talk soon.
Talk soon.
Have a great day.
Have a great day.